I'd like to go on to introduce today's main speaker. Her study, The Wow Factor, has attracted a lot of attention. And I actually read an interview where she said that if she was the Minister of Education, she would invest in creativity, culture, and arts in school. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anne Bamford.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. I've been a lot to Sweden, but I haven't been a lot when it's actually been summer. It's always been snow. So it's really lovely to be here and see such a gorgeous weather, and I think we should be outside rather than sitting inside. And I wondered if I had the worst time slot, because 8:30 in the morning after you've had the dinner the night before is not a very good time. So I hope you don't fall asleep. I hope that I keep you interested, and hopefully listening to me won't be too bad on your sort of hangovers or your sort of wobbly tummies or whatever. I thought it was interesting coming in here that this is actually an IKEA hall. You know, they sort of sponsored it, and I had this vision in my mind whether it all came flat packed and then the university had to sort of make it up, because it actually has the little things. If you look really closely, it has those little things that you need the little key for. So I thought, wow, this is really cool. What I'd like to talk about today, and it was nice, I like your introduction actually, because I was asked what, if I was Minister of Education, I would do particularly in Sweden. And I said about creativity, because I think that if you have a rich cultural heritage, if you bring creativity to what you do, then whatever you teach is more likely to be interesting. And I'm a professor, but I've got a new job starting in September, because I'm going to have to, as they say in English, put my money where my mouth is, because I've been given the job to be in charge of schools in southern England. And when I applied for the job, I thought I was a very unlikely person to get it, because I basically said what I want to do is make the schools free up and be more creative. And I got it. So now I've got a challenge to actually make it happen. I think there's 17,500 schools, so, and 3 or 4 universities and teacher education providers. So it's quite a challenge. So if I come back in a year and I've failed miserably, you can say she knows nothing. So we'll see how it goes. But what I'd like to really focus on today is bringing those elements together in terms of thinking about how we focus on the way we do things in a classroom rather than necessarily on technology. And if anyone has looked at the web around me, you would see I've actually been to Sweden a lot in the last 12 to 18 months. And I think I've been here a lot because I get a sense that, in a way, Sweden had the answer, and now they've actually gone further away from the answer than where they were. And it's sort of a very strange situation, because when I travel all around the world to other places, they always ask me, what's happening in Sweden? You know, the English government came to Sweden. I was actually part of a ministerial delegation that came to Sweden to sort of spy on your education system so that we could steal the best bits to bring back to England. And so I want to start by saying that actually you've got a very, very good system here. You've got a system that the rest of the world looks to as being very, very good. And I don't think you hear that enough. So I wanted to start by saying that right at the outset. But also to trust what you've been doing and doing very well historically, and take many elements of that forward, rather than necessarily be pushed by this global pressure, particularly around the PISA results. But I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to start with this quote, because I think this quote is a crucial quote. And it's a simple quote, but it's a very important quote. It actually comes from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It was drafted in 1946 and actually became law in 1948. It is a law. It's something you must do. But I think there are some very key elements in this that have a message for us in education that sometimes we've forgotten. The first word is actually everyone. And there's a notion of inclusivity that's in that word. This idea of how do we make something that works for everyone. Now, I've just completed actually a study, a national study in Norway as part of a larger piece of work I'm doing, which has been a study of all of the Nordic countries. I've done a detailed study of the education system in Denmark, in Iceland, in Finland. Now just finished one in Norway, and hopefully we'll also do one in Sweden and the Faroe Islands. And what's interesting in that Norwegian study is that Norway is a very equitable society, generally speaking. In fact, it's highest in the world on the equality rating. And yet there are things within the schools that are very unequal in how they're organised. It's not a fair and equal system in practice. And it's only when you dig deep that you see that everyone is not always everyone. Now I'm trialling, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, I'm doing a project around 3D in education, virtual 3D in education. And I'm doing the project in, and please, where's the guy who helped me in the taxi today? Where are you hiding? Wave. How do you say the place where I'm doing the research in? Because I can't sing it properly. You've got to sort of sing. I'm doing the research there. And people said, that's a funny place to choose. And no offence to anyone who's from there. But I deliberately chose it because it's a place that's quite isolated. It's not a place that usually gets chosen for research studies or to trial leading cutting-edge technology. And so you can see automatically in that selection, things are not equal. And I had a lot of questions from the ministry. Why did you choose there? Wouldn't it be better to do it in Stockholm? You know, okay, it's a nice area in Stockholm, love it. But is that the best place to trial things? So let's look at just that first word, everyone, and think how we're really dealing with that in a practical sense. The next one says, has a right to freely participate. Now, the word participate, I think, is really interesting too, because what does it mean to participate in your own learning and education? Most children I see in classrooms are doing pretty much what you're doing now, which is not much participation, a lot of listening. Right? And in fact, a lot aren't even listening. Once again, in the Norwegian study, I had to include a chapter. By the way, this study will be published in late August. So if you want to see what Norway's doing, all of my reports are available free to download, and I can send links, and I'll leave my presentation here and you can do as you will with all of it. I'm into sharing. But in Norway, one of the chapters I had to include in the report was about boredom, because Norwegian students are incredibly bored. I saw often students asleep in classes, and the teachers not worrying that they were asleep in class because they're quiet when they're asleep in class. Now, some of you are smiling and some of you are looking sort of guilty because you know that would happen in some Swedish classrooms as well. And if they're not asleep, they have very blank faces, you know, faces that aren't alive. Elliot Eisner, the well-known educator, once said that the difficulty for a teacher is, unlike a ballet studio, you have no mirrors around, so you don't see yourself performing. And that the only mirrors of whether you are doing a good job are reflected in the children's eyes. And they're very tiny mirrors, so you have to look closely to see your reflection in those. But those who've worked with young people and know when they're alive, you do see that reflection. You see the sparkle, what I described in the book as the wow factor. You know, this sort of like, you know, an alertness. Sadly, you see that very rarely. So I think that question, what does it mean to participate, What does it mean? Is it just about you've got a student council, so therefore there's participation in our school? Or is it something deeper than that? Then it talks about the cultural life of the community. Now, one of the things the kids tell me all the time when I interview children, and by the way, I do that every single week. And in my new job, I've requested my office is right in the middle of a school, deliberately, because I want to be able to speak with children very regularly, because that's how you learn things. And the children tell us that the teachers know nothing about them. They don't know what they're interested in, they don't know what their hobbies are, they don't know what they do when they walk outside the room. One of the most interesting things I did was in a very poor area of London, probably one of the most deprived areas of London. I visited families. I went to their homes. And when you walked inside their homes, you got a real sense of what made that child what they are in the school. And yet we very rarely know anything about the cultural life of the young people that are before us. And then I have included the arts, because the arts, I think, are both a method and obviously content. But I'm not just talking about, singing at the beginning of each day. That's nice. But what I'm talking about is how do you bring all those creative processes to bear on whatever else you're working with or teaching. And the reason I'm stressing that is actually related to some very interesting research that's come about, which is very recent research looking at brain activation. If you've not looked at any of these areas of research, start getting into reading neuroscience. I know that sounds like a big ask, but it's certainly where I think the most interesting educational research at the moment is coming from understanding how the brain works. And the new technology of scanning is enabling us to see visually thinking in process. And it's revealed some really, really interesting things. And it's also undone some of the things that we've believed for a long while. And one of the key things that I think is a secret is this idea of neuro transmission. And it's not about different areas of the brain being responsible for different parts of thinking. We've known that for some time. What it's about is the speed of the way the messages travel from one part of the brain to the other. Now, what's very interesting is when you look at the brain of a baby or a young child, a very young child, if you scan that, you see this red pattern like superhighways connecting up all the different parts of the brain. So the language and the science area and the mathematics area and the fun area, all of them are going simultaneously and across like this all the time. What we see is that the minute a child starts school, that starts to slow down, that neurotransmission, that cross-thinking between the different areas. Now, we don't know, because this research is still very new, whether school causes this or whether it's just a natural side of growing up, that this starts to stop. But for whatever reason, we lose that potential once a child is into the school. Now, what's interesting, if you then look at the brains of highly creative people, so what they did was take brains of really clever people and look at what their patterns were. What was interesting is when they weren't doing something creative, so when they were just sitting like you're sitting now, their brain activity was no different between the really creative people and the ordinary people. Exactly the same pattern. But the minute you got them doing something creative, the brain patterns were very different between the highly creative individuals and the not creative individuals. And so there's a message there in that only in the doing of it do you actually achieve the creativity. Now, those of you that have been reading this will see the sort of technical side of it as I've been talking. But basically it's about how that message passes. Now, what's interesting is that they've also discovered that sufferers of Alzheimer's and dementia have almost no movement in the neurotransmission. So what stops is that movement along those highways. So this issue of creativity, I think, is really, really vital. Now, having said that and having explained to you, you only get this if you do something, I'm going to make you do something, right? So those of you that have got laptops, pens, pencils, you have to get rid of the whole lot, and I want you to stand up with nothing in your hands. Go. Put everything down, so no papers, pens, just shove them on the ground or at the end of your row or whatever. And make sure you've got enough space to not sort of injure you or anyone else around you. This is just to wake you up if you had fallen asleep, okay? All right, so the first thing I want you to do is I want you to march on the spot. But when you march, I want you to actually move like along the top of your shoulders, right? So I don't want you to just sort of march like this. Like I want you to actually sort of really feel, okay? Let's get that going. Slow it down a bit. Arms straight. Really feel your shoulders. I want you to listen to the sound in the room and focus on keeping the rhythm together. Really well done. Swedes are always good at this because you're musical people. Feel you're going a bit faster, you're nervous now because I'm going to ask you to do something. Slow down a bit. That's good, that's a good pace. Keep it at that. Now I'm going to talk, but you've got to keep doing that and keep focusing not so much on what I'm saying. You can listen and you can keep moving your arms, so don't stop. Good. Keep it going. Now don't hurry, you're panicking again. Slow down. It's not horrible, I promise. It's your nerves, right? What I'm going to get you to do is we're going to read across these lines. See, you're losing it now because you're not listening to the rhythm. We're going to read across the lines, but we're going to say the colour we see, not the word we read. Now, you can say it in English or you can say it in Swedish, right? The first one will be green. The second one will be red. Okay, got the idea? You've all panicked and totally lost the rhythm now. Okay, because you're thinking about literacy, right? Let's get it back again. And most of you have gone like this now. All right, so get it happening again. Wear your arms. You've got to move. You've really got to feel your shoulders activating. 1, 2, 3. Green.
Red, blue, yellow, blue, black, red, blue, green, black, red, yellow, green, blue, black, blue, red, green.
Yay, well done. Give yourselves a clap. Now, did you notice what happened? What happened when you finished? When you finished, what happened? What did you notice in the room that changed? Okay, you were talking, you were moving. Some of you are going, oh, you know. It's actually not your body tired. I mean, it's not that hard to do that for a minute. It's actually your mind being tired. Because I was tricking your mind to do some of that neuro transmission. Now, you can do it simply yourself. Try, for example, when you go home tonight, brush your teeth using your other hand, right? It's good for your teeth because you'll get areas you haven't got before, but it's also will be using your brain. Try taking change out of your wallet or purse by feeling the coins rather than looking at the coins. And you should be familiar with the size and feel of those different coins. Simple things you can do to activate that area within your work. Now, what's interesting is this particularly links to a child's visual areas. And an interesting finding also coming out of neuroscience is that absolutely every capacity for visual learning you have as a baby. So really all you've got to do is sort of, fill it up when you get a child into school. You should not have to develop it. It's already there. But the problem is we don't exercise it. We don't use it. And so that capacity goes. Also what the research shows, and this is always a terrifying finding to most parents, especially parents of teenage children. Who has some teenagers themselves? Be proud, they're nice. Come on, you don't have to hide them in a cupboard. Who has teenagers themselves? Much more, much brave. Right. Okay, what we know is that the teenage brains are better than the adult brains. Now, this is terrifying for teachers too, because you're saying the children you teach actually have physiologically better brains than you, right? And this is threatening for a lot of teachers. What we know about them, for example, is they can process visual information more quickly than you and I can. Now, take, for example, I've got an 18-year-old daughter. She can't stand it if I'm searching on the internet because I'm so slow. She has already looked at 40 hotel sites, chosen the one that's got the best rooms, got the best value in the time it's taken me to look at one. My eyes can't even focus at the speed she's able to look through and make critical decisions. A lot of you are nodding. You know that this is right. You don't have to be neuroscientists to go, actually, yes, They have better fine motor control. Once again, I have this funny old-fashioned concept at my house, which is called dinner time, which is this idea that we all sit round a table and eat our meal and have a conversation. Now, I know that's a bit strange, but, we're a funny family. And what's interesting is I said I don't want mobile phones to be part of that ritual that we have, And what's interesting, my older son has been able to master the art of texting and making love to his girlfriend under the table while holding a perfectly sane conversation with me above the table. So you can see this sort of aptitude. They're more likely to learn by trial and error. And I'll tell you another story. Several years ago, in fact, this is probably going back now a decade, I wanted to use Adobe software, Photoshop, with a group of young kids as an experiment around visual literacy. And I asked Adobe, could I use Photoshop? And they said no, because it's for adults only and it's for professional designers and kids would never understand it. And at the time, I was meeting with the head of education in San Jose, and he drove a silver Porsche Carrera. And I said to him, I bet your silver Porsche Carrera for 1 month that I could get a group of 10-year-olds into your little laboratory you've got, give them your professional level Photoshop, and within 1 hour, they'll be able to use it. And he said, it's not possible. It's very difficult. Well, of course, you would know the answer. The answer was they did do it. It resulted in the development of the whole Adobe suite for schools because they'd never even realised that kids would be able to do this work, and I won my bet. They don't start at the beginning, and that was actually part of the secret of how they could learn the software so quickly. Because we were filming them they were using the computers and the computers were actually filming them. And what we realised was that they didn't start, all the grown-ups, right, step 1, what do I do? Step 2, what do I do? They didn't. They just jumped straight in, experimented any which way that they wanted, and then they learnt. Right? And they also started to do things that even the designers of the software didn't know it could do because they felt free to play with it and to, that they wouldn't break it, which was the fear of most adults. And yet we sort of ignore this in how we teach them. So we don't start by saying, what do you already know about mathematics and where would you like to start? We start with a book and we say, right, I think section 1 is a good place to start. They can multitask. When we used to say, turn off the TV, you can't do your homework properly with that television going, actually they do it better with the television going. The biggest problem now is children are suffering in exams because they're so quiet and so focused. They're not used to working without their iPod in their ears. So it's posing a challenge. As I've already mentioned, they can scan and analyse information very quickly. They're more creative, they're more likely to experiment, learn by play, and as I said, they're more intelligent because they have much more movement in this distributed cognition. I won't go into this because I saw the wonderful thing. I love that little timeline you've put in the front of the book that you've got, and then it was a shock, was like, gosh, it was at 2005 when YouTube started. I thought it was only last year, It's this sudden and rapid growth of all of this technology. But at the same time, it's not just about the machines. I do a lot of work in technology, and I'm the most untechnical person you've ever met. Like, I literally cannot turn the channel of my television over anymore. That's because there's now 7 remote controls and I don't know what any of them do. You know the problem. But I can't. I have to actually get my kids in. Can one of you put it on to BBC, please? So I'm not at all technical. And I don't think it's about being technical. It's about how you think about learning, how you think about children, and how you think about the ways we deal and communicate in a classroom. I call the next slide lip service, because I think that's the problem with what most education systems give to this area. For example, in England, as you probably know, they said every class will have a smart board. They invested millions, and every class has a smart board. But I would say 99% of those classes could do exactly the same thing on a blackboard as they currently do on their smart board, or even on a piece of paper and a pen. They could have saved a huge investment because it didn't fundamentally change pedagogy. Even within the 3D project that I'll describe in a moment, we trialled it across 16 classrooms throughout Europe, and only 2 teachers out of the 16 fundamentally changed their pedagogy for something that radically altered their classroom environment. So schools have remained fairly traditional, fairly consistent over decades. So why the school? Why does the school need to change? What we do know is 92.7% of all school curriculums in the world say that creativity is really important, right? So they all say it. They're all sort of right in there, right? But there is a big gap between the practices that actually happen. One of the findings of the wow factor, for example, was that in a quarter of all cases, arts education was so bad, it was actually killing off creativity, right? So it was actually doing worse than if the child did nothing. So, in some ways it would be better if we didn't have it in the curriculum. What things work? Now, this is interesting because when I did the wow factor, we looked. It took in all countries of the world. We asked them to present detailed studies of what worked, to cross-analyse all those studies. And what was interesting is, despite the nature of the studies, the things that worked were highly consistent. So in a way, these are the simple things you can do to make better education. And there's only 10 of them. So if you fall asleep for the rest, get these down, because these are the things that work. First of all, partnership and collaboration. Who do you work with? Who do you work with? The more and better and deeper those relationships are, the better the education. Second thing, flexible organisational structure. Now, this is one of the ways where Swedish schools have actually gone backwards. Because 10 years ago, Swedish schools were more flexible than they are now. They've become much more rigid in recent years. Because if children are really learning, they don't want to be held up because it's the end of their 45 minutes. They want to keep on learning. They need to have flexibility. If teachers need to work together to achieve an aim, then they need that flexibility. I was at a Swedish school recently, and the principal was really trying to focus on this issue of flexibility. And he said the teachers were fighting him. We don't want to be flexible, they were saying. And he'd finally pushed it that they could have 1 week every term where they would be flexible. That was the agreement, you know. And in that flexible week, the children learnt so much more. But even with that, even with all the results, the teachers wouldn't make more flexible weeks in the term. There was only 1 week per term. Accessibility to all, that open approach works. Diversity is actually good for learning. The more different types of people you have, the more likely you are to have interesting learning. Professional development is key and really important, especially in the area of creativity and technology, because good teachers of this, years ago when I did my PhD, I followed 22 highly accomplished teachers. And one of the things I found about those teachers that they had in common was that they always said, I'm still learning. I'm still learning. And that's a really key thing. Having time to reflect and evaluate, and this is really hard. In a business, they try to leave 10% of their resources for understanding how well they're doing. But we don't leave any resources in a school for understanding how well we're doing. We're supposed to somehow understand it in the drive home or something like that. How do you keep it local? How do you make it relevant to the area that's just near you so that people feel a sense of community? How do you encourage the child to adopt the idea that they are a researcher? Now, this is actually a photo taken from the project I was describing in the very deprived area of London. Here, 98% of children do not speak English as a first language. And these children are 3 years of age. So it starts from 0, from birth, and goes right through to when they are 8 or 9 years old. So we're looking at very early experiences. And the children were the researchers. Right? They were the researchers on the research project. They had small digital cameras for recording their learning. We used the smart boards to upload the things they'd learned. They would have group discussions amongst themselves using the smart board, and then they would be put up so that parents could get them on their mobile phones or get them remotely, this information, so that by the time they picked the child up from the childcare centre or from their preschool, they had something to talk to the child about because they saw what the child was actually learning. Now, to give an example of how serious these children take their role of being researchers, I was watching one little girl and she had the camera poised like this, and she was watching a little boy playing with a puppet, right? And she held the camera and she held the camera and she didn't push the button. And I was watching her and I suppose about 10 minutes passed and I thought, maybe she doesn't know how to use the camera, which I was really surprised at because the kids sort of automatically seemed to know. And so after 10 minutes, I sort of said to her, are you okay? And she said, yes, I'm waiting for the moment. And I was like... And she was obviously just sitting there because she was waiting to take a particular photograph when the boy did a particular thing, which he then went on to do. Now, I quote that to my PhD students because I say, as researchers, do we wait for the moment? Do we take time? Another quick story about the same project. I asked the children to interview their teachers. Now, remember, these are 3 and 4-year-olds, right? So they can't write or read, most of them. And I asked them to interview. So they're asking questions to their teachers. And they asked me questions as well. They actually asked me a really good question. They said, what toys do you play with on the weekend? And I had to admit none. And then I thought, and so I actually got a bike for my next birthday so I could give a good answer to that question. But they were interviewing the teacher, and the teacher was talking away, and then the little boy just looked up and said, "Would you please slow down, because I can't write down everything you're saying," and of course they were just scribbles. But this idea that the child can research their own experiences, I think, is really important. The importance of children performing learning. Now, when I did the Danish study, Denmark was really interesting, because Danish schools are really good in some things and not good at all in other things. And one of the things they were not good at all in was getting the children to perform their learning. And if I can give a bit of an early sort of impression, I think that's a bit of the case in Sweden as well. How do your children perform their mathematical learning? How do they perform their scientific learning? Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're having concerts for science or whatever they could do, but it's more about how do you push them to the publication level so that they feel they have to really do a good job. Now, the impression I get from some of the Swedish schools I get into is they're not pushed to that level of really having to do the very best job and having to perform what they've learned and really present it in its best possible way. How do you give children a diversity of languages? And what I'm meaning here is not can they speak English and Swedish. It means can they speak visual? Can they speak dramatic? Can they speak sound? How do they use those things? Because if they're going to communicate their message effectively in the future, they're going to need to be able to use those literacies, visual literacies, dramatic literacies, gestural literacies, and so on. And take risks. If you are in a leadership position, and I think every teacher is in a leadership position, certainly every school principal is in a leadership position, every director of curriculum is in a leadership position. Every politician is in a leadership position. Every parent is in a leadership position. If you're in a leadership position, you must actively model taking risks and failing, right? You have to model failure. And the reason I say that is if you don't model failure, children feel, I can't fail because something terrible will happen if I fail. Who has done something this week that has gone terribly wrong? Put your hand up. Excellent teachers or excellent educators, because you've tried something that has gone wrong. If you didn't put your hand up, you're probably not trying hard enough to take those risks. Okay? I did an interesting piece of research in England. I put up 20 photos on the internet and asked teachers to choose the one that most closely represented how they felt about their working life at the moment. You relate to it. I also asked them to choose the one of how they would like their job to be in the future. And this was the one that was chosen. Very different images. I want to give you some results too, and the reason I'm stressing this for you is because I know here the pressure of the almighty PISA is the big driving force in all of these schools. Interestingly and importantly, the results for Sweden in PISA have not moved at all. They're exactly the same almost as they always have been, right? So despite what you hear from the politicians who can manage to take a tiny little difference like that and extend it to make it look like we've made a massive difference, you haven't. You're almost exactly the same as you've been. So all this radical sort of crackdown back to basics has made almost no difference in your achievement. And you do pretty well in the world picture. But there's a great study by a guy called James Cattrall. And what he did was he looked at data for 25,000 pupils in the US, and he looked at what was the difference or what differences occurred between successful kids and unsuccessful kids. And what he found, the crucial difference was whether they attended what he called an arts-rich school. So if they went to a school where they had a lot of creative experiences, they did well. And he backtracked this. So he did this by looking at all of their results. What he found, for example, is kids that went to an arts-rich school were actually better at mathematics than those that didn't. They were more likely to have teachers that used new pedagogies. They were more likely to read, more likely to write. Happier pupils, happier teachers, less behaviour problems. He didn't stop just when they were in school, because he then tested again when this 25,000 people were 20 years of age. He found that the children that had gone to the arts-rich school continued to do better. For example, this is just picking a few of the statistics. There's many, many in his report. His report, by the way, is called Doing Well, Doing Art. You can get it online. 17.5% more likely to go to university, more likely to volunteer, more likely to have strong friendships. This one's interesting. 20% more likely to vote because they think, this is important. And 10% less likely to not be doing anything. He continued to follow them through till they were 26 years of age. Once again, the benefit they had in school of going to that more creative school led them to go on not just to do well, but to do considerably better than the children that hadn't. They found better jobs, and this is a really crucial finding. They were 5 times less likely to be dependent on public welfare. 5 times. So very high figures. Interesting findings too about learning inside the classroom versus learning outside the classroom. In fact, a classroom is probably the worst place to learn anything by the statistics. 9 out of 10 pupils said they remembered things much better when they were not inside the classroom. And yet, do we take any notice of that? We could just get rid of all the school buildings and start funding it a different way. This is interesting. 86% of teachers felt that the children were better outside the classroom too, right? So the teachers don't want to be in the classroom either. Primary teachers, the ones working with little children, were much better at using the outside as a learning environment. High school teachers, secondary school teachers were the worst at using that environment. What was interesting too, though, was the more senior teachers, so the older teachers, were far more confident about using the environment outside the classroom than new teachers. And I think that's a terrible comment on teacher education, that the people who have been there longest realise that the classroom is not the best place to learn. But the young ones are not learning that piece of information. If we look at the school system, this is quite a sort of simple diagram, but I think it's helpful. If we look at what we do in a school, we force kids to participate. So if we take this as the participation line, participation in school is high because we make them go, right? We force them to go. But where do we sit on relevance? Where do we sit on relevance? Is it very high, so it's up in that corner, or is it way down in this corner? Now, what's interesting, in Norway, children, especially very clever children, are choosing not to participate in school anymore because they realise they can get something more relevant by not participating, by going and getting education somewhere else. Now, if the trend continues, there won't be schools, like they'll just gradually, all go. It's changed the type of child who's pulling out of school. The type of child who's leaving school is no longer the child who's not very good at learning. It's the child who is very good at learning. And they realise they can learn in other ways. They're looking for more relevance, so they're no longer participating in the formal processes. This is just bizarre research, but because you had a monkey in your thing, I thought I should follow the theme a bit through. What was interesting was that when you put a new monkey into a group of existing monkeys, very quickly that new monkey learns to behave the same as the other monkeys behave. I'll comment further. Quick, keep you awake now. I want you to look at these and I want you to put them in a group of 3 letters that have to have all something in common, right? Go. If you don't understand, ask the person next to you. You have to have 3 letters in the category. Who still doesn't understand? Talk more. Talk more. Okay, stop. You came up with one answer. I now want you to come up with a completely different answer. Same question. Go. Okay, stop again. Now, I could be mean, but since you had a late night last night, I'm not going to be too mean and ask you to come up with a different one, and then a different one, and then a different one. Because there were probably as many different possibilities, at least, as there are in the room. Who made their first possibility around the shape of the letters? Put your hand up. Now, leave them up, leave it up, because I want you to look around. Look around. Now, what you actually did was almost 100% of you were visual learners, right? Almost all of you learnt through visual means. I can tell by looking at you, the way you're looking at me, that the majority of you are visual learners. Who based it around something associated, such as, for example, the names of their kids or the names of a word or something like that? Okay, they're your associative learners, right? They learn by connecting it to another experience. Who remembered it by some sort of sequence, like they sort of thought of it in some sort of order or connected it in some sort of order? What did you do? Can you explain how you did it?
I divide them into the first 8 letters of the alphabet and the rest of the word.
Okay, a mathematical way of looking at the same problem, right? Now, you can see very simply in that exercise there were multiple answers. Also, did you notice what I did? Be honest now. Who did not understand the task when I first asked you to do the task? Be honest. Who didn't understand, right? At least half of you, right? When I asked again who didn't understand, there were only a few people that were sitting sort of together up the back there. The way you learnt was how? How did you go from not understanding to understanding? Talked, right? You shared the bits you understood and you came to a pattern of understanding. And yet in most classes, what do we say to the kids? Don't talk, right? Or we do things to stop them talking. So we say you've got to have a laptop each because then that's going to stop you talking, right? Actually, it'd be much better if they had one laptop between 3 kids, because it would force them to work things out together and actually learn more. Now, to give an example of this, I use the iPhone because it's a very good model of how this type of learning works. First of all, it didn't have an instruction manual. When you got the phone, you didn't get an instruction manual. So you were forced to ask others, how does this thing work? Or to play with it and work it out yourself. Right? Also, the apps didn't exist. There was no such thing. That whole industry didn't exist. There was no school course. There was no university course. Somehow, within no time at all, people had developed these things. How did they do it? talked. They communicated, they shared the bit of knowledge they had with the bit of knowledge someone else had, and they kept making more and more things. Recently in my local newspaper, one of the children down the road is 10 years old, and he's developed an app for the iPhone that when your doorbell rings, your phone lights up. So you know when someone's pushing your front doorbell. Because even if you're out, you'll know someone's come to your house. You know, can't do anything about it, but you know they're there, you know. He has already made £250,000, this little kid, through developing this application. He's learnt it not at all from his teachers, not at all from his parents, but from people out there, diverse people. We asked a group of employers in England what they look for when they employ a young person, and this is what they said: communication skills, team working skills, and confidence. They didn't say literacy or numeracy. We need creativity. This is actually a real product from the internet. It's called Essence of Creativity. And you drop it, this is true, I'm not making this up, you drop it on your wrists, and in the morning, when you wake up, you'll be more creative, just in case you're struggling with this topic. I wanted to show you something quickly interesting. I know we're running out of time. I'll be fast. But this is a weird but interesting graph, right? A computer person has looked at every time in any academic article that's ever been written in the world, creativity's been mentioned, right? And he's plotted the frequency of creativity being mentioned. Now, what's interesting is the orange line is actually education. And the most creative time for education was the early 80s. Who trained in education in the early 1980s? Who did their training then? You're the most creative, right? Rest of you, not very good, right? High spot for creativity then. If we look at the yellow line, though, the yellow line is actually computer science. Now, when computers were invented, nothing much creative happened with them for 30 years. So in the hands of the scientists, nothing really creative, right? In the early 80s, now you can cheat and use your little timeline in your book here. Something happened that they thought maybe people will be more creative. Do you know what happened then? Guess, call it out. Now, it wasn't the internet. The home computer. And they thought when everyone has their Commodore 64, they will do really creative things, right? And so there was some hope. But then they realised, no, they didn't. They just played Pac-Man and it really wasn't very creative, right? So it went down again. Then something happened around the year 2000, and then someone guessed it before. What was that thing that happened in the year 2000? In a wide way. Internet. Right? This is when the internet really took off. Now notice what's happened to research around creativity using computers in computer science in that time. The same person, and don't worry, you can't read this, the same person tracked how many times every word was said in these articles. Now what was interesting, obviously creative and creativity are 1 and 2. Well, it should be, that's what they were searching for. But if you look at the other words in the top 10, they're thinking sort of words. My favourite word is number 7, which is because. Because. When I was a little girl and I was naughty, my dad would say, stop being naughty. And I would say, why? And he would say, just because. And it's like he was right. It is, this is why we do it, just because. Because is because of innovation, because we can turn our creative ideas into things people want. And I use a quick example of a coffee cup. If I get a coffee in this cup down here in the local area, it's probably about 20 kron, yeah, roughly. If I take exactly the same coffee, but I put it in this cup and I put it in a nice cafe with music and whatever, it's about 40. Isn't it? For exactly the same coffee. But interestingly, we want this one. But what education are we giving the child? Is it that one or this one? You know, don't you? This one I thought you'd like to see. Europe measures the pillars of innovation, and this is the new measure on how successful a country will be. And I actually have it in my handbag to prove it to you. This month's or this week's Economist magazine says Sweden is the most progressive economy in the Europe at the moment. It's doing the best. I can show you. I can go, nah. And what they actually measure to determine that is this thing called the European Index of Innovation. It measures under these categories, actually measures a whole lot of things. This is economists, not arts educators. But if you look under, so if you take human capital, look at what it measures. How many hours of creative stuff the kids are doing in a classroom. Because that's a predictor of the sort of people you're going to have in the future in your country. Now, what you might like to know as well is this is all the countries in Europe. That's the European average. Guess who's here? Sweden. You're the top in the world, or in Europe at least. Hot on your heels, though, is Finland, and they actually want to beat you. I wanted to very quickly, before I finish up, touch on this 3D project that I've mentioned that I'm doing here. It's part of an exciting collaboration from a lot of IT companies. It's the first time where previous competitors are all working together around the same idea. They're talking to each other. So we've got Texas Instruments, we've got Acer, we've got Epson, we've got Smart, we've got a whole lot of these companies that would normally, Dell and whatever, normally would all be competing. They're all working together to look at the notion of what will happen in education with 3D virtual reality. Put very simply, at the moment, the kids have to wear very funny glasses. The project is called Life, Learning in Future Education. And it's not science fiction, it's happening now. As I say, it's happening in I've got to sing it, very close by. So it's here. And what it means is that you can virtually project anything in a 3D form into your average classroom without needing anything in particular. It can project onto a wall. That even one teacher, we had the heart going and he was wearing a white T-shirt and he had the 3D heart beating on his white T-shirt. What's the impact of that on learning? We've just finished the project and it was really focused on learning, not on the technology. We really wanted to look at whether it would transform practice, whether it would actually change it. As I said, in that way, only 2 out of the 16 classes did actually totally transform in terms of how they worked. And both of them became far more student-centred than how they'd operated before. It caused, one of the really early results of it is that it had caused distinct improvements in children's learning. In fact, really marked improvements in children's learning. Now, this is a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is it's wonderful that we've found something that helps kids learn. The bad thing is poor teachers could just say, let's put the 3D on because that'll work, and that's not going to be a good idea. But I thought this was an interesting chart, and I won't go through this. What we did is a very scientific experiment because we did pre-tests and we did post-tests, and we have a control group and we have an experimental group, and we've got it in 8 different countries, and they have to be taught exactly the same content, but one gets the 3D and the other just gets it in 2D, but exactly the same. Very controlled experiment. And one of the things which we didn't expect to see, I have to say, in the research, was that with the pre-test and the post-test, in the 2D classes, many kids actually do worse after they've had 8 weeks of teaching than had they not had it. And to prove it, if you look at the chart on this side, this column here, this one here, are the results of the pre-test, and this is the results of the post-test. And the children hadn't been introduced to the topic at all prior to the pre-test, so they knew a lot, even though the teachers never covered it. All the scores in red are where the child actually ended up learning less after 8 weeks. And I have to say, it's not a comment about the teachers, because we had really good teachers. Could you imagine the sort of teacher who's keen to volunteer for this experiment? right? They're not bad teachers, they're fantastic teachers, you know. Interestingly, and this is not just, but this is the 3D scores, and there was only one in the 3D score where they actually had got worse after the testing. Yeah.
I don't understand what exactly they do in 3D. I mean, the reality is three-dimensional.
Yeah.
So what...
Well, it's interesting you say that. The reality is three-dimensional. How is it different? If I give an example, the content they were all using was about the body, and we were doing it with kids that were sort of 11, 12, 13 years of age, okay? And it's about the body, you know, the heart, the lungs, hearing, smell, sight, and they all had the same content. And that was a problem because the content's in English, right? But the visual is, of course, international. But if I describe a class in Paris, that will probably answer your question really well. In the class in Paris, there's a very good science teacher, and he was doing the heart. And he started the science lesson with a video about the heart where there was a guy having a heart attack and then someone resuscitating them, and the kids had to come up with a theory, what's happened to this guy in the video. Then they had to do some ideas about what might have caused him to have the heart attack. Then the class teacher actually had real hearts, sheep's hearts, on the tables, and the kids had to dissect the sheep's heart, so they were 3D, right? They're solid hearts. He had the plastic model of the body that's also 3D, you know, where you have the organs in. And then what he did was he also, with the 3D technology, he can project the heart, and when you've got the glasses on, it appears like the heart is huge and it's right in front of you, no matter where you're sitting in the classroom. And you can also turn it, move it, you can go inside it, outside it, and so on. And at the end of the lesson, I said to the children in interview, okay, you actually had three things that were 3D. You had the plastic model, you had the actual heart, and you had the projection. Which one did you like the best? And the kids said, we liked the projection, 100%, because it was more real. And this was amazing because the heart, the real heart, was very real. It was bleeding, it was smelling, it was quite a hot day in the Paris classroom, and you could smell this in the classroom. But for them, the virtual was more real. Does that answer your question a little bit? So what the kids were able to do was to see the concepts, see the heart in actions, follow the oxygen passing from the blood cells and so on. They also were able to take it apart and put it back together, because that was the problem with the sheep's heart, is once they'd cut it up, it was no longer a heart, so they couldn't put it back together again. Also, what we noticed was really interesting, when we tested the kids in the 3D, we asked them at the end of the unit, make a model of what you've learnt. The 3D kids all made a 3D model, whereas the 2D kids all made a flat thing, even though we gave them the same material. Some of the things that the kids said, I won't read all of these. There is a big difference between 2D and 3D. When you learn something, 2D is flat, but 3D has depth. It is real. This comment about realness, about the virtual, came up a lot, which I think is really interesting. You can see it move, and then we understand it. Views of the teachers. Interestingly, this teacher said, I noticed a big difference with the boys. The boys were particularly engaged in learning in this way. Parents liked it. The parents were really happy about it. It's amazing. My daughter was actually sick, but she wanted to come to school. And as I said, this comment often, this idea of we want to learn it, it's more real when it's like this, which is an interesting thing. But what it means in a practical sense is we can have anything in the world virtually projected into our classroom. At the moment we need the glasses, but it won't be long we won't need the glasses. I wanted to finish with this image and leave you then. And this is actually, though, something that comes from several thousand years ago in China. And it's actually education policy. I like the look of this as a policy document in and of itself. And it was also an example of a very early form of the internet, right? Because what they used to do in China to get the messages around a very big country was outside the temples they would have these stones. They're about my height and about as wide as me. And pilgrims would walk from one area to the next. They would rub the stones, roll up either on silk or paper, roll it up and walk on to the next town, and then they would share what they'd learnt at the last town, right? So it's exactly the same as the World Wide Web. Just some poor guy had to walk, right? But it was the same concept of sharing information. And this is an education policy that was shared. Now, what's nice about this policy, which is far more radical and modern than how our policies are presented now, was it was presented as image and as poetry, because they realised that people would understand the image and the poetry much more than if they wrote it as a book. So the image is bamboo, and if you've ever grown bamboo, you'll understand this. But basically what it says is that bamboo is incredibly strong and it will always be there. And so its point is schools and education will always be there. They're not going to ever go. But what it says is that there are some things in education, represented by this bent branch, that have had their day and need to go. They're old and of no use anymore. There are other things, represented by this branch that goes up here, that are strong and robust and should always be part of education. And then down the bottom, there are new ideas that need to be allowed to come up and grow through that. And the poem here says that about that image. But there's something even more important, and this is a special message for Sweden. Every single character that's here is in fact replicated in the leaf pattern. And if you looked long enough, you would find every one of the characters in the poem in the leaves. The message there is sometimes you have the answer, but you have to look again to see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring session. I have a diploma for you. It's from UNICEF School in a Box, which means that instead of a gift for you, we'll give school bags to
brilliant, fantastic.
Children.
That's wonderful, brilliant. Thank you.
We have a few minutes if you want to ask Anne some questions, and if you're not comfortable to ask in English, I can try to translate for you.
You're all terrified or tired. Of you brave people.
Just comments on the latest UK proposals to cut back on humanities education, which could be a serious blow for creative thinking in general.
Totally insane. Totally insane. I mean, it's interesting though, the response has been that a group of high-profile professors have set up a private university to put the humanities back in, you know. But I think everything, it's interesting watching education. It's like a pendulum swinging. And I think Sweden and Norway went like this, and now they're trying to go like back again. And I think England's still slow, and it's still going this way. But it's crazy. I think it's particularly crazy in England. And I'm from Australia, so I can say this. In that they spent 10 years investing to get a more creative and effective system of education. And then they've taken 1 year to destroy what they took 10 years to build. As a colleague of mine said, is you don't plant an apple orchard, wait till it's bearing fruit, and then chop down the apple orchard, which just seems insane. So I think it's mad. I think it's totally crazy. But that's as well what influenced my decision to move into the schools more directly, to be able to try and influence making sure it stays in there. Because I think as a university academic, you're removed a bit from the coalface. So I want to go closer to the one up there and one there, I think.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. what's your next project?
I never know. I'm just really lucky because people give me crazy things to play with and then I play with them. I mean, the 3D thing, they want to carry on with doing life too, but I've told them if they're going to do that, that I want to have the countries themselves take it forward. So hopefully there'll be, I'm looking for sort of in each of the countries, so in Sweden, looking for some universities that want to take forward the research here and play with the toys as well, because I've sort of, you know, I've started it off, but I want now the countries to really start to play with it. I think also it would be great that we share a lot more, because one of the privileges I had doing that research, for example, Turkey was one of the countries involved, and their schools are great. They're fantastic, and I'd never been into a Turkish school before, and I think we need more opportunities for teachers from different countries to really get to understand what each other's doing, because you have a lot of the same problems and also a lot of opportunities to share, and we really don't let the children or the teachers mix. And one of the good sides of this project was we invited all the teachers involved to come to BET, you know, the big technology show. Have anyone been to BET in London? Yeah. We invited them to come to BET and to really meet each other and share practice, and it was fantastic. And I just think there should be more chances like that. But what in life too, the plan is to go with more pilots. So it'll still be a pilot project, but maybe instead of having 2 or 3 schools, we might have 5 or 10 schools, having local universities taking charge of the research and working with teacher education and so on, and then doing a lot more networking. They've already set up a sort of big website where they'll be able to blog and share and do all of that. So I think that would be something exciting to take forward. There's still, of course, the evaluation of education in Sweden to come.
Okay.
There was one, or if it's been answered. Was there someone there?
Okay, I think we're running out of time, but I'm wondering, you've studied a lot of countries. I'm wondering whether there's a pattern of similarities between, for example, the Scandinavian countries or the Anglo-Saxon countries, more classical education system. But we're running out of time. That would be very. Have you seen any sort of?
Yeah, I mean, with the work I'm doing in the Nordic countries, they're available now as individual reports, but the proposal, the Nordic Council is going to support it being put into a single book that will have a sort of... I don't like making comparisons because I think you can never... It's like your children. You can't sort of say this one's better than that one or whatever because they're all different. So I don't like making comparisons, but you can start to see shared patterns. I think the things that are similar are a lot stronger than the things that are different. There's more that's the same than things that are different. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.